All right, let's restart. So welcome back from the coffee break. And so a forum is a place of discussion. And as such, we wanted to bring some discussions to the Quantum Forum. So there will be one in the afternoon more on the experimental side. And this one is for the theory, but also about broad implications of our research. So the topic is cryptography in the quantum computing era. And just to set the stage, I'll just give you the very short story that everybody knows when you start working on quantum research or when you first hear about quantum computing is that, well, quantum computers can factor large numbers. A lot of cryptography is based on this kind of problems that are easy to verify but hard to solve for a classical computer, like precisely given a large number, what are the two prime factors? So quantum computers will be eventually able to break this kind of problems efficiently. Therefore, all the cryptography that we have now is doomed. So again, I'm not saying I agree with this. We'll get into the details of that a bit later. So, and to be a bit more precise, like quantum computers can solve in principle, they're efficient quantum algorithms for a wide class of problems called the hidden subgroup. And this encompasses a few problems that are used in classical cryptography, right? And this is the questions of how we will have good cryptography for the future when we have large-scale quantum computers, but also like what secrets do we have to protect now. So to help us discuss all of this, I have three guests here, and it's a bit like Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. I have the professor of cryptography past, of classical cryptography. So we have Dennis from the Foundations of Cryptography group. Then we have the professor or the ghost of quantum cryptography, which is Renato from the quantum information theory group. And then we have Kenny, the ghost of future cryptography or post-quantum cryptography from the applied cryptography group. Also in the computer science department. Okay, so I have some questions to discuss with our guests, and then there'll be open questions for the audience. And I ask maybe Andreas to keep me on track of time. All right, so the first part is about how the effect of quantum computers in current cryptography. So I'll start with Dennis. So what is the scope of the problem? Like what kind of tasks and protocols would be affected by quantum algorithms?
Okay, I hope this mic works. So it is bad. It is actually bad. What this means is that much of the cryptography that we use today for online shopping, for communicating, or for even running your computer for updates, it uses cryptographic building blocks. It uses actually all of these things use a variety of cryptographic building blocks like public key encryption, secret key encryption, hash functions, signatures. And a part of these building blocks is largely, or like the things we use, the instantiations we use for part of these building blocks is not affected very much by quantum cryptography, by the prospect of a universal and large-scale quantum computer. And another part, in particular the public key cryptography or the public key encryption and signatures part, is heavily affected, as you said, because all the instantiations, all the standards that we currently have are based on problems which can be solved efficiently with a quantum computer using, in particular, Shor's algorithm. And there are, so it's really bad, and this really affects, if one of those building blocks doesn't work as it should, then this endangers the whole chain, if you want. Mm-hmm. And this is, for instance, as I said, just browsing the internet would become inefficient. Would become insecure, but also text messaging, like on Signal or Telegram would be maybe a more complicated story because Kenny has a recent work on Telegram in particular. But generally, instant messaging or also, like I said, securing your software on your computer. This all is affected by this. Not so much because, in principle, a quantum computer would break public key cryptography as such as a building block, and there's no replacement. But because the current standards and instantiations we have, they rely on problems that seemed to be still hard for a classical computer for relevant key sizes, but that would be broken by a quantum computer. So I think this was a very exhaustive. I don't know. Please ask maybe more specifically, or I can tell you more about what's currently going on to remedy this fact, because people are aware of this, of course. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, we're touching also Kenny's area of post-quantum cryptography. He's involved in one of those approaches where, so there's currently a standardization committee. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, they're trying to standard all kinds of algorithms and encryption schemes and signature schemes and all that for a post-quantum era. That means these are classical algorithms. This is not quantum cryptography in the sense of quantum key distribution. These are simply classical algorithms which, however, currently appear to be resistant to even to quantum attacks. And Kenny's involved in one of those proposals. So there's currently like a competition going on, and Kenny's involved in one of those proposals.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So you talked a lot about impact in everyday life, online shopping, and so on. What about the kind of thing that governments are maybe more worried about? Or maybe I could say, what kind of secrets, maybe this is also for Kenny, are people worried about protecting now for the quantum computers that will exist in 20 or 30 years?
What kind of secrets? So governments, well, I don't know.
Maybe someone.
But frankly, I don't know what secrets governments, I mean.
So would you be worried about the transactions, the things that you do online now, being decrypted in 30 years' time?
So I would personally, so this is very subjective, of course, but I think the threat is not so much losing your credit card number when you shop via Amazon or some other retailer, some other online retailer, but it's more the prospect of potential mass surveillance or like large scale things that like scale easily to a very large scale, like protecting software or like, for instance, right now you have a Windows copy or a copy of your operating system where you get updates automatically, and you cannot do anything against getting updates except for unplugging the network cable. But you will get those updates automatically, and they are certified to be from Microsoft or from the vendor using cryptography that currently is susceptible to those attacks. Mm-hmm. And I think this and mass large-scale surveillance that I would think are very practical threats. Mm-hmm.
Can I add something?
Yes.
So I broadly agree with Dennis, but you asked specifically about, say, government secrets. None of us work for the government directly. Not directly. Yeah. We all do, actually, because we're all... the ETH Bereich, of course, is a... Anyway, so if you're a government and you have data that you want to keep secret for a long time, for example, diplomatic cable sent between the Swiss embassy in Washington and the foreign ministry in Bern, that kind of data, which gives situation reports or views on the political situation or comments about the mental state of the president, are very sensitive data and can remain sensitive for long periods of time. And then additionally, you have, say, communications between, let's call them operatives, spies, working in the field. They these days would communicate using electronic means with their back to base. And as far as I understand, I mean, we don't have access necessarily to the exact algorithms that government is using and that these agencies are using. But in general terms, they're using the same kind of cryptography that Dennis was talking about that we use for our online banking or online shopping or for social media. Mm-hmm. And so there is data now that's being transmitted, and through traffic analysis, you can identify maybe what of that data is interesting. And even though it's encrypted, using metadata analysis, so looking at traffic flows, being able to put a network tap close to the Swiss embassy in Washington, for example, mm-hmm. do you imagine that the US government is actually recording all of the traffic coming out of the Swiss embassy in Washington? Almost certainly, yes. Because we learned a lot in the 10 years ago or so from the Snowden revelations about the capabilities and the intentions of national security agencies like the NSA, like GCHQ in the UK. And their determination is to listen to it all, to know it all, to learn as much as possible. And very famously, Michael Hayden, who was a very senior person in the US government around the time of the Snowden revelations, once made the statement, "We kill people with metadata." And what he meant by that was that metadata, which is not the data itself, but the data about the data, so like the IP headers or some information about traffic flow, that data is extremely valuable for finding targets and eliminating them. And that means, deploying kinetic means against individuals in foreign countries. And so there's a lot of traffic data flowing on networks that you might want to keep secret for a very, very long period of time. And one of the issues then, which Dennis mentioned, is that you could record that data now, and then in 20 years or 30 years, if you have a large enough scale quantum computer, you could then break that traffic. Okay, and then read what was being said 30 years ago. So if the sensitivity of your data has a very, very long lifetime, and you think there's a reasonable prospect of, let's say, cryptographically relevant quantum computers being available in the future, then you need to be worrying now already.
Yeah. Do you know if, this is public knowledge, right? You know it, you say it. So do you know if governments are doing anything to protect now against this kind of thing? Are they going offline, back to old school methods of pigeons and secret emails?
I honestly don't know, but in preparation for this panel, I looked at what the NSA advice was currently, National Security Agency in the United States. They have a role both to defend United States government data and the citizens of the United States, but also to penetrate foreign systems. So they have this complicated dual mission, but for the part of it which is about protecting the United States and their citizens and so on, they are talking about once NIST, the NIST competition that Dennis mentioned, once that completes, they plan to adopt some of those algorithms and use those. So, but it's hard to say whether they've actually changed their practices already to deal with the kind of issue that you're talking about.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yes. Yep. So maybe one question before we go towards solutions. So how worried is the broader classical cryptography community about this? How actively are people working on this? Because I don't see so many working on quantum and post-quantum cryptography.
I think in particular because of the competition, but also already before, it's a bit, on the research side, on the purely academic side, there is actually a rich body of different problems or kind of problems you could use for cryptography. There's mathematical lattices, there are codes or coding theory, there are other methods from algebra, from commutative algebra. So there's a bunch of things which people are looking at already for, depending on what you count, for more than 30 years. And so there's awareness, and it's generally also an argument that there is the prospect of a quantum computer, so we should look at that particular primitive. But there are two things which complicate, or in my view, there are two factors which complicate this. One factor is that, there is, so the prospect of really a large-scale quantum computer was only made prominent in the last years, really. And before that, it was always, we have Shor's algorithm, but we need a large quantum computer, and there was not really, I'm not a physicist, I'm particularly not an experimental physicist, so I cannot assess this really, but it seemed like this was very far away. And the second thing is that the standards evolve very slowly. So once you have a standard for encryption from the 90s or it dates back to the 90s for secure browsing, then this is a very long-lived thing, and vendors are very hesitant to change anything unless there's a concrete attack. And we're not there yet. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that people are aware of this. People have been looking for this for a very long time. And only right now, people are getting to the point of trying to standardize things, and that's that's just a tough business, standardizing concrete algorithms.
Yep, thank you. So we will get to classical algorithms against quantum computers, but before that, also for the physicists in the audience, maybe we can talk a little bit about quantum cryptography. So is quantum cryptography a viable alternative? So first, maybe just summarize the idea behind quantum cryptography and why it's not vulnerable to these quantum attacks.
Okay, yes. So I would maybe make a distinction between the theory of quantum cryptography and the practice. And I think in theory, quantum cryptography is an almost perfect solution. I mean, first of all, it's nice for physicists. It shows that we can use entanglement and so on. But it's also extremely clean because it doesn't rely on any assumptions that are hard to quantify. I mean, it's not only that we cannot be sure whether these computational primitives are really, or whether these computational problems are hard. We can also not put a number on them and say how hard it is. So we don't know whether they're hard, but we also don't have a measure. So we are kind of really far away from a well-defined statement that we could make. And in quantum cryptography, you don't have that problem. You have an extremely well-defined set of assumptions. There are assumptions about physical laws and certain additional assumptions about which are the parts that an adversary can really influence and which not, that you still have to make. If the adversary intrudes your office, then of course it gets insecure. But apart from that, it's very easy to understand what has to be there. And then there is a mathematically clean proof that shows you the key is now secure. So that's the theory. And I think this theory is really wonderful. As a physicist, I like that. Now, for the practice, there are, I think, two major problems. One will solve itself automatically, and that's the problem that today's quantum cryptography systems are actually insecure just because of the way they are implemented. So, of course, you have this nice theoretical idea that you need to generate entanglement and so on. In practice, you don't usually do that. You maybe you generate entanglement sometimes and sometimes not, so you have to post-select. You also have imperfect devices. The devices simply don't do what the quantum cryptographic protocol tells you should do. And so I would not recommend to anyone who has sensitive data, as you two were talking about, to actually use a quantum cryptographic scheme that exists today without an additional encryption. You could have it as a kind of additional layer of security. Say, like you use that scheme, and then in addition you use, let's say, some symmetric key or some symmetric cryptographic system, or even a public key crypto system. But and the reason is really that we are in a very early stage at actually building the devices. But this is the problem that will solve itself, and it will in particular solve itself once we have quantum computers. Because building a quantum computer is, I would say, strictly harder than building just a quantum memory. And once we have a quantum memory, all these problems that we currently have with quantum cryptography, like the fact that these signals are not clean and so on, could actually be solved almost immediately. So instead of sending immediately a qubit that you generate using some source, you first put it into a memory and then make sure, let's say you copy the memory into another memory so that there's no side information. The problem is always side information. You want to generate a qubit, but the actual physical carrier not only has the information encoded in that qubit, but also in some other degrees of freedom. But if you copy that into other memories, then this additional degree of freedom will not be copied. And that's actually why classical cryptography doesn't suffer from these problems, because before the message goes over the line, over the telephone cable, it has been copied many times within the computer so that there is no side information. That's at least my view. And if you would have a special purpose one-time pad, it would suffer from the same problems. You could just measure the voltage and probably find out what was going on. So this problem will solve itself, also the distance problem if you have memory. So that's all good. There's another problem, and the other problem is simply that it doesn't replace public key cryptography. So you can do secure communication between two parties that you have identified before and set up, but you cannot talk to someone arbitrarily just who has somewhere deposited his public key. Mm-hmm. So it's simply not a it's not a replacement for public key cryptography, in particular not for example, signature schemes and so on. And that's the other problem. So it solves, let's say, once we have quantum computers, it solves a certain part of what has been broken or will be broken by quantum computers. So that's how I see the situation today or in the future.
Thanks. I have two questions. One is if you know of research into these other parts of that are needed, so the authentication, for example, and public key within the quantum cryptography, so for quantum schemes.
Yes, so I mean, if it's just about authentication from point to point, that's not a problem. That you can do even classically in an information theoretically secure way, so you don't need computational assumptions in principle. But if you really talk about a public key scheme in the sense that I want to like have a secret exchange with you, but we didn't meet before and just kind of have some initial password or key, then we need this public key structure. And it seems, I'm not sure whether there is even an impossibility result, but I'm pretty sure, like from the structure of how cryptography works, quantum cryptography works, this is not, I mean, this doesn't fit into it. So I'm sure people tried, but I'm pretty sure you cannot, at least, I mean, with the current ideas that are around, maybe you need to give up something we have somehow, or some completely new idea, but at the moment there is nothing you can do which does not again involve computational assumptions. So this idea of asymmetric cryptography, the asymmetry makes it really hard to find something, to find some physical analog. So I think the answer is simply this doesn't exist, and we need something completely new, a new way of thinking about it.
Yeah, my other question was, so you said that the first problem, the technical problems, will solve themselves because building a good enough quantum computer to factor large numbers is strictly harder than building a network for quantum cryptography. But the part that I need convincing about is the network part of a cryptography network. So you need like very high quality like optical fiber cables. And you know I couldn't put the camera closer to here because the signal gets lost in there's like 10 meters in the camera. So yeah, whereas to factor large numbers, I just need a local quantum computer. I don't need networks over kilometers.
This is clear. Yes, you need actually basically a quantum communication channel, and we don't have that yet. So the infrastructure that we have are just optical fibers, and the optical fibers are okay. They're quantum channels, but they are the kind of routing points which are classical. So one would have to replace all of them by quantum computers. So it would be a huge investment. So in a sense, let's say if you don't care about the amount of investment, I think it will solve itself, but you will still actually need to make the investment and put regular nodes everywhere. And the distance problem will just be solved by having enough nodes. And these nodes don't need to be trusted once you have quantum computers. So you have, in a way, a clean solution, but it will be, I mean, depending on how expensive these quantum memories will be, it may be a very expensive solution.
Yes?
Can I just chip in there? I totally agree with Renato about this. And
I hope.
Absolutely. But I think you've put your finger on it. And in the end, if you think about pragmatically about security, so I'm not talking about the physics or the long-term prospects, but like the problems that we need to solve in order to secure our communication, it does come down to cost in the end. And so if you want to make, say, a commercial success of quantum cryptography or quantum key distribution, as many people have tried to do, you have to find a way to convince people to make this investment. And this is not about science, but I have one foot in both of these worlds of like, trying to do the science, but also trying to understand what will fly in the real world. And so there are extremely hard-headed business executives who make decisions about investment in network infrastructure. And you have to find a way to get them to understand what is the kind of the value proposition of adopting something like a fully quantum network or quantum key distribution, even over a kind of point-to-point solution. What does it bring? And I think one of the challenges is that quantum key distribution, as Renato explained, I think it's beautiful physics. And I say that as a non-physicist. I can still appreciate the cleverness of it and the neatness of it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily solve a problem that we can't solve already by means that don't require special purpose hardware and don't have constraints on bit rates or network form, or can be implemented in software and can be deployed through software update to existing infrastructure. So this is absolutely nothing to do with the science, but it's all about how would you make that transformative step from today's networks to this kind of future quantum internet that people have been talking a lot about. It's not clear to me how you make that transition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, you need to. There's much more incentive to build a large-scale quantum computer capable of breaking current. There's much more incentive for people who do have the money and institutions that do have the money to invest in building a large-scale quantum computer capable of breaking cryptography than to build a network of. And this is part of the problem at the moment.
Can you if I may,
Yeah.
ask you a question? I mean, you said we have solutions for that today, or in the near future. So let's say, if you focus on the problem of just, let's say, a company has a data center somewhere in the mountains and they want to secure this line. And now, I mean, they could consider using quantum cryptography. And suppose we are already at the stage where these, let's say, practical problems are solved, that I mentioned, and it's still expensive. I think one could say there the advantage is that this solution will essentially be timeless, because it's based on physics assumption. And I guess, I mean, my question to you is the solutions you have in mind would still be solutions based or which rely on computational assumptions, which kind of have, in a way, potentially a finite lifetime.
Yeah, they do. So indeed, so thinking pragmatically about it, if you want to use public key cryptography at all, there's always a computational assumption involved, as far as I know, because the public key is public. So the problem of recovering the private key from the public key is a well-defined computational problem, which may be equivalent to factoring or solving discrete logs or something. So you're absolutely right. There's a key point of difference there, which is that for the kind of solutions I was talking about, in contrast to the QKD ones, they're not timeless. You may need to update your algorithms or your parameters once again in the future. That's absolutely true. On the other hand, you could, in those kind of point-to-point systems that you're talking about, just use fully symmetric key solutions, which of course, again, are not timeless and rely on computational assumptions. But as far as we understand them, they're not really significantly affected by quantum computing, with our current understanding of what quantum computers might be capable of doing. And just to take one small step further, the promise of QKD is really realized when the QKD system is running at the same bit rate in terms of the keys that it agrees as the communication path that you want to secure. And until you reach that point, QKD systems are actually, agreeing these keys at two endpoints, but then using them in the kind of classical algorithms that we're currently using today. So this kind of promise of unconditional security according to the laws of quantum physics is, as you pointed out earlier, it's a wonderful theoretical thing, but it's actually quite hard to realize in practice, not only because of things like the distance constraint, but also bit rate constraints. So again, pragmatically, I would say you're absolutely right that the exact underlying assumptions are different between the kind of quantum systems you're talking about and then these like more classical systems. But pragmatically, it's acceptable to go down that route from a kind of a risk analysis perspective that we do when we deploy secure IT systems.
I think I would agree with that, but if I may add one point. So I think the communication, I mean, you pointed to the communication rate, which is indeed, or the communication rate at which we want to send data is actually much higher than the key generation rate.
Right.
But what one could right, but one could expect is that once we are really at the stage where, let's say, because just of miniaturization, we are anyway building devices which are kind of operating on a kind of single photon level and so on, that at some point there will not even be a big distinction between actually quantum communication and classical. Even a classical, let's say, communication channel may actually use components that are almost quantum components in some way. So I could imagine that at some stage this difference will disappear and we will almost automatically, when we communicate, actually do quantum communication, because this is just the most perfect communication. It's communication without noise or without, let's say, loss in some way. And so, I mean, that's a possible scenario that these two things will just converge and we will not make this distinction between the key generation rate and the classical communication rate.
So that's a really interesting point. I guess one counterpoint to that is to look at the history of the development of quantum key distribution and compare that to the increase in network bit rates that we've seen over the same time period. So quantum key distribution has got faster and faster in terms of the bit rate that it can achieve, and very, very impressive progress has been made. But the gap still remains because network speeds go up and up and up and up, and we want to do faster and faster communication.
But I think you should normalize it by the amount of money that is invested in the two technologies. And then I think, I mean, I would say there is very little investment still on the scale of what is done in communication technology into quantum cryptography.
I think that's true, and but I think a lot of the investment that you're talking about for classical communication is sunk cost. It's already been done.
Yes,
okay,
that's right, yes.
So maybe we'll come back to quantum cryptography when there's audience questions, and now let's talk a little bit about post-quantum cryptography. So the overall premise is to make classical algorithms and protocols that are resistant against quantum attacks. So what's the state of the field?
We've actually touched on it quite a lot already, so I think the most important thing for an audience composed mostly of physicists is to say, as Renato has pointed out, the algorithms that we're developing there are, in some sense, best effort. We think that they will be secure against quantum computers, and we have some evidence that helps us to believe that, but we don't have any proof of that. So these are classical algorithms which are based on different underlying hard problems from the ones that are vulnerable, say, to Shor's algorithm and to other quantum algorithms that we know about. And so this has been an active research field for maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years. Actually, it goes all the way back even to the 1970s if you look at the Macaulay cryptosystem, although it was never really designed for quantum resistance in mind. But it's a field that has, as a research field, has grown a lot in recent years, partly because, frankly, academic cryptographers need something to do. But more recently, because we've seen this remarkable progress in quantum computation, and although we're still maybe 5 or 6 orders of magnitude away from the size of quantum computer that we need to get something that's cryptographically relevant, the progress is fast. So if there were a quantum computing Moore's law, we wouldn't actually have that much time before we need to really change our algorithms. And you can also argue that for like the data that needs to be secured now for the long term, we should already be using these kind of post-quantum or quantum-resistant algorithms. So the long and short is that in the research community, we've been developing these replacement systems for a while. And then in 2016 or 2017, the US government started this post-quantum competition that's not a competition, but it is actually a competition, to try to select a portfolio of new algorithms. And then that fired a starting gun really on a kind of explosion of research. So if you now go to any of the mainstream cryptography conferences, there will be multiple tracks or sessions on post-quantum cryptography, design of new algorithms, new attacks, implementation experience, integration with larger scale protocols like SSL-TLS, for example. So it's a very active field. And NIST received something like 70 submissions to the call for submissions in different categories. And over a series of years and rounds of competition, they've now whittled it down to, I think, 5 finalists in the kind of public key encryption category, and I think maybe 3 or 4 finalists in the kind of digital signatures category. And so we're now all sitting waiting with bated breath for NIST to say, these are the algorithms that we have selected. Some subset of those finalists will be put forward. But then there's a long process to take those academic research papers and specifications and turn them into standards, and then for those standards to get implemented and deployed at large scale. So we're looking at like another 10 years maybe until we would have kind of wide-scale deployment of these new quantum algorithms. You might wonder why is this all being driven by the US government? It isn't really. It's actually an international competition. There are teams from all around the world involved in submitting these proposals. And the point is that these US government standards effectively become de facto international standards.
Yeah, one thing that surprised me about what you said is that you said that people are already working on implementations of these protocols and other things.
Absolutely.
When security of these things has not been proven yet. So,
well,
I mean, what's the criteria to make it to the finalist list of this non-contest?
So we do have security proofs in a sense. I mean, that's something, for example, maybe Dennis can say more about, because the community has intensively worked on proofs that show that if you could break this, say, public key algorithm, then you must be able to solve this underlying hard problem in some sense.
NP
right? So
hard or no? No, for sure. No,
some
for sure,
of them, oh gosh, maybe I would pass over to Dennis at this point for the low-level detail.
Maybe one thing about the competition. So this is not like a completely non-standard process per se. We had a similar similar competitions a while ago for hash functions, because the old standardized hash functions were simply broken, and now we should use different hash functions, and something similar for symmetric encryption. So there, the motivation was not quantum computers, but simply that the old schemes, old stuff was more or less broken or becoming insecure. And so what quality do the assumptions or what quality do the schemes have? So there's actually there are good reasons why we cannot hope to have public key encryption or signatures. Well, no signatures. Well, both of them in some sense, but there's a qualitative difference. We cannot hope them to be based on an NP complete problem. So. And because otherwise complexity classes would collapse, and this would be very surprising. We cannot prove this. We cannot prove that there can be no NP complete crypto system, simply because this would involve showing that P is not equal to NP. That's like one of the most famous questions in theoretical computer science. But the problems that we do have, some of them are in the lattice region, for instance. They are kind of approximations of NP-complete problems. And there's a broad spectrum of hardness ranging from, so there's like a parameter, and if you switch that parameter to 0, you get something which is easy. If you switch that parameter to, let's say, 11, then you get NP completeness. And somewhere in between, there's the things for which we have cryptographically interesting schemes, and for which there is no classical algorithm, or there is no algorithm to solve these problems. So it's kind of related to NP hardness. And again, so this is something we believe that those problems actually might be in some sense, in a complexity theoretic sense, asymptotically harder than, for instance, factoring large numbers, because they live on a different kind of level of the polynomial hierarchy. But at the same point, the concrete parameters, to choose the concrete parameters, like Kenny said, that's like another thing that will take years to settle on first of all on implementations, and also even on choosing the right parameters. And that's, I think, what this competition is also mainly, or not mainly, but much about, is to find good parameters where people say, okay, we have this asymptotically maybe complicated and complex and hard problem, but we want to translate this into something where you can base your hiding your secret communications on. And that's what's happening right now.
And there are some experiments going on to see what would the impact of deploying these new algorithms be on some of the major secure communication systems that we use, like TLS. That's the thing you use every time you browse the web to Facebook or buy something online. And so Google and Cloudflare did some experiments over the last couple of years where they took some of the very early but leading contenders in the competition, and they deployed them, but in a hybrid mode alongside the classical algorithms like elliptic curve cryptography or RSA-based encryption, so that they didn't put any users at risk, but they also had at least the guarantees that we currently have from the systems that are currently in use. And then you get some early stage deployment experience of like how, what will the effect be on, say, how long it takes to browse the web, how long does it take for your bank's web page to load, and because these new algorithms, they don't have quite the same attractive set of properties that the classical algorithms that are vulnerable to quantum computers do have. So they have larger key sizes or larger ciphertexts, or some combination of non-ideal properties that we would like. And this seems to be the cost, in a way, of getting quantum resistance, which is you have to give up on some of the very nice structure that you have that enables you to get everything very nice and small in the current systems. And so it's important then to start this process of also seeing what will the larger scale impact be of making this switch. But those experiments are they're early stage, they're underway, and they're being done partly by academics, but also by some of the large companies in this space. So I mentioned Google. Cloudflare, if you don't know them, are like what are they? They are web hosting and cloud services provider, I would say.
So if I can summarize without any subtlety what you said, it looks like the price to pay for quantum resistance will be a very slower internet, and we're trying to work on both on proving security and trying to make it a bit more efficient.
Right, but we're talking here about a few milliseconds slower, okay? But if you're an Amazon or a Google, those milliseconds matter because your customers leave and go somewhere else if you're too slow. And there's studies that have actually shown that the amount of people that things buy on websites decreases as the page load time goes up. So we do want to really squeeze as much as we can on these things. Absolutely.
So, Lídia, you used this word quantum resistance, and I would have a question to the two of you on that, because the main motivation still to do quantum cryptography is that we will not rely on hardness assumptions, which are always unproven. And I think, as you pointed out, the proofs are basically the proofs that if we could break that, we could break another problem. Now, if you talk about quantum resistance, what you mean is if you could break the algorithm, the cryptography, the post-crypto scheme, then we could also solve a certain problem, maybe with a quantum computer. And so the assumption is therefore that a quantum computer cannot solve this problem. But now, how many actually try to solve the problem using a quantum algorithm? Because if I now look again at the research we do in quantum computing, compared to classical computing, there are still very few. I mean, just the manpower is small. There are very few concepts, ideas. And so isn't it kind of too early to even have an idea of what is actually hard on quantum computer? Because after all, it will rely on the statement that simply no one broke it so far in some way. Or maybe there's stronger evidence, but my understanding is at the end we just have a bunch of clever people who try to actually find an algorithm. They didn't, and therefore we are saying, actually, it's probably hard to solve this problem.
And that's how it's always been in cryptography.
Right.
Ever since the advent of, say, public key cryptography.
But now the set of quantum algorithm developers is much smaller. That's
it's true. So I guess maybe to push back a little bit on that, when was Shor's algorithm published? 93, 94? 94. So we've actually had, I agree that the number of people looking at it is small, but it's such an attractive area that you think that like a lot of smart people have tried and maybe failed to come up with new quantum algorithms for it. So maybe the power of quantum computing is just limited. But I agree, it's still a young field. It's only 28 years since or 27 years since Shor's algorithm. On the other hand, in the history of computer science, 27 years is a long time. There's a long way to go. So it is possible that these new hard problems that we're putting down might even not turn out to be hard classically. We might find out over time that there are better classical algorithms. So like, this is very true in lattice-based cryptography. We're still learning a lot. And this is a real challenge for NIST, for example, because they have to make decisions about how to move forward, which algorithms to select, when really I think what we'd like to do is have 10 more years of research, or maybe even 20 more years of research before we make decisions. So it's a very, very difficult position to be in, but it's the best that we can currently do. Until maybe, we have these like global quantum networks with quantum memory and everything is solved. But meanwhile, in the real world, we have to think pragmatically about what we can achieve and do the best that we can with the tools that we have.
But I would love to do an experiment where I would ask you to kind of send your most beloved or most important secret over a channel, and you can choose between quantum cryptography and one of these post-quantum schemes. And it's maybe in 40 years we'll try to to read it. Would you really?
How far am I sending it?
Okay.
Because here's the thing. I mean, you could say, "Oh, look what's happening, say in China with this very nice link from Shanghai to Beijing, however many 100 kilometers that is. It's a quantum secured link." There are lots of points in the middle where data can be intercepted, right? So I wouldn't send my secret over a quantum network
if it was more than 100 to the center.
If it was more than 100 kilometers, right? Maybe slightly further in free space.
Well, let's say from here to the center.
Okay.
Would you go for that option?
Just take it in your pocket.
Take the bus.
Take the bus. Safer.
No, you only have these two options. Either use quantum cryptography or post-quantum cryptography.
Yeah, I would be quite confident that the current algorithms. First of all, I would try to use a purely symmetric key scheme, if that's allowed,
Fair
because
enough,
of course
yes.
QKD
Yes.
effectively
Yes.
requires some initial key to get going. So let's put it on a level playing field. And then I'd be very confident about the long-term security of the advanced encryption standard, so AES. I wouldn't really have any problem in using that at all. On the other hand, with the quantum systems, I think you touched on this much earlier, that in practice, making them really secure against all kinds of side channel attacks and so on, we have a lot still to do in that direction to make the practical implementation secure. I think we have a lot more experience of doing that in classical cryptography than currently we do in quantum. And so I would go for the classical solution. We can run the experiment if you like. It'd be great.
So maybe for everyone, so in terms of funding distribution and your general optimism about the long-term prospects of the field, so how would you compare the urgency versus the actual funding given and support given to quantum computing hardware in both academia and industry versus that given to like quantum resistance cryptography, both QKD and post-quantum cryptography? How does that affect?
I've been speaking a lot. I think really feel like I should give my colleagues a chance to help with that.
I cannot really assess that because I don't know how much or what the volumes really are.
What I can say is, like, for post-quantum cryptography, I think we feel, always you want more funding, right? But I think we feel that we have a strong community that's doing a good job and that we are able to get hold of the funding that we need. And one of the key things here is, like, for the work that we're doing, mostly it's software. And that involves somebody maybe buying a little bit of server time or sitting with a laptop, and it's a person at a desk. So a quick story, if I may. When I was working in the UK before, I joined a kind of UK-wide quantum cryptography network, which was, I think it attracted something like 25 million, which is, in the UK context, is quite a lot of money. And it was announced that this thing had been launched, and my name was there as one of the PIs in this big program. And 2 weeks later, in the mail, I got a quantum optics catalog, which was a full-color, 500-page long, heavy thing that sat on my desk, full of all these amazing mirrors and, lasers and all kinds of stuff. And then you realize, okay, physicists to develop quantum cryptography in a lab setting and to start to take it towards commercialization require expensive equipment to do their work. So I can see why maybe more money is required to develop something like QKD than is required to develop post-quantum cryptography. We're cheap.
But I would say there's now certainly a lot of money going into quantum computing, and as I pointed out, this is actually what we have to do in order to improve quantum cryptography. I think it's more efficient instead of now making more experiments with direct quantum key distribution, we will have to invest in quantum memory. That's right. Kind of the way to go forward. And that's happening in the context of developing quantum computing. And in that sense, I think there is actually good investment at this point, so one cannot complain.
So before opening for audience, just a question, how optimistic are you all about this?
About what specifically? I mean, I think a really important question is, will we ever get cryptographically relevant quantum computers? With the science, in some sense, is done, and it's just an engineering challenge, but boy, is it a tough challenge. And so it will be very, very interesting to see, for example, whether IBM is able to keep up with its announced roadmap for the development of quantum computation. They have a very, very ambitious roadmap, and they're promising many hundreds of bit size quantum computers with low error rates in the next year, 2 years. It'd be very, very interesting to see, or what the next step that Google takes. And I think that will enable us to get a better sense of what the real prospects are for cryptographically relevant quantum computation.
Yeah, on the post-quantum side, I'd also say we're on the science part, we're in a very in a good state already. And we're about to standardize things. Maybe the post-quantum, without wanting to take away anything from you, Renato, but the post-quantum, the quantum cryptography protocols, maybe there's more potential for not exact replacements, but let's say better replacements for concrete protocols for signatures, let's say.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for some questions from the audience. See if someone has. We can. Yeah. Yeah, there's two on the back. No, I'll just wait for the microphone.
Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Joa from the Applied Crypto Group with Kenny, actually. And I have a question for, I guess, mainly Renato and the physicist. So it's mainly about, so Renato, you talked about a lot about QKD, and Kenny was talking a lot about post-quantum crypto. And post-quantum crypto can run on our phones, for instance. QKD, you need very expensive equipment, and you made a bet over 40 years. So my question is, do you think that in 50 or 60 years we'll be able to have quantum computers, let's say, deployed at a scale which is a bit larger than just a few large companies and just a few governments? Or do you think that it can become a bit more mainstream, let's say? Because it was also the case for classical computers, right? Before it was just a prerogative of just sort of very big research labs, and nowadays we have phones in our pockets. So how do you see that, Renato?
This is maybe a question I would pass to our experimental friends, because I think for me it all depends on whether one actually finds a way to do quantum computing without the need for cooling to the amount we need to do now. But if you're talking about this time scale of 50 years, let's say, then I wouldn't dare to make any prediction.
Okay.
Let's say, Lídia was before asking whether one is optimistic. For me, the most optimistic scenario, sorry, Andreas, for saying that, is that quantum computers will fail and we will instead discover some new physics that sets in when we have very complex entangled systems, and that we suddenly find what we thought will work doesn't because of an interesting reason. But that's another story. But I think it really depends on technological development. And if you ask about the timescale of 50 years, I think it would be not reasonable to make a prediction. But maybe Andreas can say something about that.
I'm not on the panel, I guess, but I think it's, in any case, as you say, it's a very interesting scientific question and very challenging. And you also point out that so far we don't know why we shouldn't be able to build a quantum computer on some fundamental reasons. Yeah, and thus, if we think we're good enough on the engineering and the science side, I think we should be quite optimistic to be able to build one. Yeah, and if we find out a fundamental reason why one couldn't be built, yeah, then that's probably a very interesting result. Yeah, maybe something with which you would win a Nobel Prize if you found that out and then experimentally proved it.
But maybe to complete the answer, I would just say if we are able to do it, then I would expect that we can also miniaturize it at the end, because I don't think we will end up with huge devices. Because to have scalability, we anyway need to be able to make them small.
So one of the aspects that I find important is that likely, if you look at the investment in conventional computing technology, it's been gigantic. And the reason for that it was possible was that there were products that people were willing to buy, and that money that was earned with it could be put into further development of this technology. Yeah? And I think it will be an important question at which stage quantum computing technology will actually be a product that people buy, and that the money earned can be reinvested into making these things better. If it requires similar amount of investment as semiconductor technology, then it will be very hard to get that money for that development. But I'm not on the panel. So there was another question here, I guess.
Yeah, hello. Clemens Todd, Werner Wegscheider's group. And as such, we are very experimental. We do hard work in the lab. And now we don't have a dilution fridge in the cellar. So the question is, who would actually be the attacker? Who can have a quantum computer and start breaking your codes?
Yeah, the problem is that it's a very asymmetric problem overall, right? You only need one quantum computer in the world for this to be a problem.
Exactly.
So, as for agents who own this, from big companies to big governments,
Exactly.
right?
Yep.
It's a big company, and then you can say that big company is trying to break our codes.
Yes.
But it's more likely to be a government.
Yeah.
Foreign government that's not so
We're
friendly
talking
towards
malicious companies and malicious governments.
Yeah, but there are many companies that are very close to governments, right? Because they have to be. And so it's maybe, I don't want to get too much into politics, but like separating the commercial world from the governmental world in this space is sometimes quite hard. This is the same in, say, the defense sector. It's also the same in the intelligence sector.
But the model which already works now is that we have kind of cloud quantum computing. So as you know, IBM already offers that, of course, on a very small scale. And if you have that on a larger scale, so that you can run Shor's factoring algorithm, then in principle everyone could do it. Of course, the question is whether they would still offer that on that level. But let's say, I mean, the point I want to make is that probably we'll have some kind of cloud solutions. And
much everything will be broken before this, because the moment you have one quantum computer, this already breaks everything. And I mean, as for malicious is a very subjective term, right? I'm sure this government thinks they're doing their job and they are protecting their thing.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll do a short break, maybe 10 minutes, just to breathe a bit outside, and then we'll continue after at 40 past. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to my panelists. Thanks for watching.